The Empty Country Club. Laura had never posted to Reddit before. She wasn't the type to share personal stories online, but what happened to her one night disturbed her so much that she created an account just to put it into words. She had tried to reason through it to come up with some normal explanation, but nothing ever made sense. People close to her dismissed it or suggested she was exaggerating, and she was tired of feeling like she was losing her grip. She thought if anywhere would understand, it would be the Reddit community. The event started with something small. Laura and her friend Adriana had to switch cars that day, something they almost never did. It seemed like a trivial detail, but later she would wonder if that one unusual decision set everything else in motion. Adriana worked at the Atlantic City Country Club, a place with more than a century of history behind it. Founded in 1898, it had the reputation of being haunted, and stories about strange happenings there were common among locals. On that night, Laura went to pick Adriana up at 10:45 p.m. She mentioned that a wedding was in full swing and that she was surprised that she got off early. Normally, the place would be packed on a Friday night. The night carried its own weight too, since it was Friday the 13th, under a full harvest moon. Laura didn't think much of it at the time, but the coincidence stuck with her later. They then stopped briefly at Adriana's house so that she could grab clothes for a sleepover, and then Adriana remembered she had left her night's cash drop behind. They proceeded to turn back to return it. By then, nearly an hour had passed, and it was 11:45 when they pulled up to the country club again. Immediately, something felt wrong. The front lot, which had been full earlier, was now completely empty. Not a single car was parked out front, even though a wedding party was supposedly still going on. There was no music, no voices carrying from the building, just silence. Adriana told Laura to wait in the car while she tried the front doors. She found them all locked though, and inside it was completely dark. That was when both women heard music, faint, muffled, and drifting from the side of the building. It wasn't the thump of modern dance music either, or even the kind of band you might expect at a wedding. It sounded older, like something playing on a phonograph, the style of the 1920s. They both looked at each other in shock. Adriana decided to check the side entrance since that seemed to be where the sound was coming from. As she walked over, Laura sat frozen with a tightening feeling in her stomach, as if the air itself had changed. It felt thick, almost heavy, and her instincts screamed that she shouldn't be alone. Through the blinds, she could make out figures moving inside. Adriana proceeded to knock. The music and conversation then stopped abruptly. Then came a man's voice, stern and sharp. "Wait a second, who is that?" The tone was simply enough to completely terrify her. She turned back and ran as fast as she could back to the car without waiting for an answer. When she finally got in, she was shaking, struggling to catch her breath. She said the men's voices had gone dead silent after she knocked, and that the way the man spoke made her feel as though she had been caught intruding where she didn't belong. Laura's dog, who was with them in the car, began growling and pacing, ears back and clearly distressed. They then drove around to the employee lot, expecting to see cars there if the front lot was strangely empty. But that lot too was barren, aside from one company vehicle that was always there. Nothing about this matched the story Adriana had told earlier of a busy wedding with packed parking lots. Still disturbed though, they decided to take the back exit that wound to the groundskeeper's area. Adriana had worked at the club for years and knew the layout well, but as she drove, she kept insisting she had never seen this part of the property. They passed a small building with a light on, but it didn't look like anything that belonged to a luxury country club. It was old, run down, with the look of something abandoned long ago. Neither of them wanted to stop, and the short drive to the main road took only about 5 minutes, but both swore it felt stretched, like they had been wandering in that strange zone for half an hour. For the rest of the night, they replayed everything over and over, searching for any rational explanation. Adriana promised to text her manager and coworkers in the morning to see what they remembered. When the replies came, the two friends were left even more terrified. Everyone insisted the wedding had gone late into the night. The guests and staff had been there until 2 a.m. The lots had been full to the point where jitney buses were shuttling people back and forth. There was no way, they said, that Laura and Adriana could have found the place empty. The side entrance they had tried was under remodeling and completely closed off. The details simply didn't line up with anything they had experienced. Laura remembered clearly being there from about 11:45 until 12:20. They had both seen the darkened interior, the locked doors, the empty parking lots, and the unfamiliar building. They had both heard the old-fashioned music too and the men's voices. Yet, according to everyone else, none of that was possible. A shift on the porch. When he was 18 or 19, a man had an experience outside his childhood home that has stayed with him ever since. He had lived in that house nearly his whole life, moving there when he was only 3. By then, daily walks in the nearby park had become routine, something he had done almost every day since he was 15. On a summer afternoon, sometime around 1 or 2, he slipped on his shoes and opened the front door to head out like usual. The moment he stepped outside though, something felt very wrong. Everything looked exactly as it should: the ravine next to the property, the tree in the front yard, the steep slope of the driveway, and the familiar houses across the street. Nothing had changed, yet the neighborhood felt strange. It was as if reality had shifted slightly out of place. The air carried a weight he couldn't explain, and the world around him seemed almost unfamiliar despite appearing perfectly normal. He stood on the porch for a while, frozen in place and trying to figure out why his surroundings felt so off even though they looked so normal. After a moment, he tried to brush the feeling away and walked down the driveway. Halfway to the street, he noticed his neighbor tending to the garden. The man looked up, caught sight of him, and went pale. His face showed a mix of shock and disbelief, like he was staring at something he shouldn't be seeing. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but before a word came out, the scene suddenly shifted. Out of nowhere, he was back at the front door with his hand on the knob, about to step outside. The abruptness of it left him rattled, like time itself had folded. He pulled the door open again, but this time everything was as it should be. The strange heaviness was gone, and the air somehow felt normal. His neighbor, on the other hand, was no longer at the garden. Shaken up, he chose not to go for his usual walk. The memory of the afternoon lingered for years after that, not only because of the odd reset back to his doorway or the look on his neighbor's face, but because of how wrong everything had felt. Nothing had looked different, yet every instinct told him it wasn't the same place he had always known. For a brief moment, it seemed as though he had stepped into another version of his own neighborhood, one where his presence didn't belong. Awoken by a Lamp. So this story begins during his last semester at college when a young man was assaulted by a football player who outweighed him by more than 200 pounds. The impact knocked him out cold, and in that unconscious span of time, he slipped into what felt like another life entirely. In that life, he met a woman who immediately drew him in. She made him nervous and excited all at once, and though she kept her distance at first, he stayed persistent. He waited out her boyfriends, kept trying, and eventually she let him in. Their relationship grew slowly until they ended up being married, and not long after, she gave birth to their daughter. He supported the household with a good job while she stayed home with the child. 2 years later, they had a son, and from then on, his mornings began with a quiet ritual of peeking into his children's rooms before leaving for work, showering them with affection in the small moments that made family life meaningful. For nearly a decade, this reality unfolded naturally. Then, one evening, while sitting on the couch, his attention drifted toward a lamp in the corner of the room. It had a red base with gold trim and a square white shade, but something about its shape was wrong. The angles seemed to look inverted, as if the lamp existed in 3 dimensions but belonged to a geometry that didn't line up with the rest of the room. He found himself staring, caught between fascination and discomfort, and from that moment, he couldn't pull his eyes away. The first night, he sat up in front of it, unable to really fall asleep. By the next morning, he didn't care about work or food, and by the 3rd day, he had stopped moving except to stare at it, while his wife grew frantic. She took the children to her mother's house, leaving him on the couch as his mind unraveled. At last, he understood what was happening, that the lamp was not real, and neither was the room, the house, or the family that he loved. 10 years of memories dissolved in a single realization that none of it had ever existed. The lamp grew larger until it filled every inch of his sight. Voices began to rise out of it, strange cries and distorted sounds, until the world collapsed into searing pain. He opened his eyes to then find himself lying on a sidewalk, bloodied and missing teeth, surrounded by a crowd of strangers. The confusion was immediate and crushing. A police officer pulled him up and dragged him across the grass to a squad car, choosing not to wait for an ambulance. At the hospital, scans revealed the truth, that he had been unconscious only seconds after the assault, and the entire life with his wife and children had been created inside his mind. In the years that followed, he struggled with grief. He mourned people who had never been real, sinking into deep depression as he longed for a family that no one else could acknowledge. At night, he hoped to one day find them again in his dreams, but his wife never appeared, although at times he caught fleeting glimpses of his son, always 5 years old, never speaking, and always out of reach. But yeah, the loss of those imagined years haunted him as heavily as if they had truly happened, leaving him caught between 2 lives and unsure which one he wished he had stayed in. The Nowhere Road. In the Midwest, a 19-year-old set out late one night to drive home from a friend's house tucked deep in the countryside. The trip should have been simple, though the narrow back roads were never easy to navigate in the dark. He wasn't an experienced night driver either, and when he realized he had likely taken a wrong turn, he pulled off onto a hilltop to get his bearings. With no signal on his phone to guide him, he stepped out of the car, hoping to orient himself by sight, but the moment he opened the door, the world around him was no longer the same. The air that met him was bitterly cold, far too cold for May, when the weather had been mild all week. Below the hill, where there had always been woods, he now saw 4 large houses standing in a neat row. Their shapes were unlike any homes he had ever seen in the area. Each one had a rounded, domed roof with a skylight in the center and long entryways that jutted outwards like tunnels, giving them the appearance of enormous igloos built in brick and stone. He could only stare in disbelief until a floodlight snapped on in one of the yards. A man emerged, bundled in a heavy winter coat with the hood drawn tightly around his head. At his side was a dog with a thick silver coat that seemed to shimmer under the artificial light. The man spoke softly to the animal, but the words were carried in a different language, full of elongated vowels broken by sharp, chirping notes that he couldn't place within any human dialect. His fear spiked and he bolted back into the car, speeding down the road until he spotted headlights approaching in the opposite lane. At first, he thought it might ground him in some normalcy, but the vehicle that passed was unlike anything he had recognized. Its body glowed with lines of light tracing along the chassis, and inside of side mirrors there were only smooth metal. Its body glowed with lines of light tracing along the chassis, and instead of side mirrors, there was only smooth metal. Across the windshield, a strange emblem glowed, something like the letters H and F fused together, encircled by writing too small for him to read. Even the sound it made as it moved past was wrong. Not the rush of tires or the roar of an engine, but a strange, drawn-out hiss that reminded him of something alive. He slowed instinctively to study it, and the driver of the other car seemed to do the same, as though both were equally shocked by what they saw. After a while, he finally pulled off to the side of the road. He sat there in silence until he could catch his breath before stepping outside again to convince himself the world was solid. This time, the night was no longer frigid and the familiar landscape stretched out in front of him. Only a short walk ahead, he could make out a billboard he recognized, pointing the way back toward home. Too frightened to climb back into the Pontiac in case whatever had happened returned, he decided to leave it parked and make his way on foot. He thought he would at last retrieve the flashlight he kept in the driver's side door, so he circled back to the spot where he had left the car. The road was empty. The Pontiac had vanished entirely, as if it had never even been there. He retraced his steps again and again, but there was nothing. Hours had passed without him realizing, and with his parents already asleep, he called his friend, who eventually picked him up along the roadside. The next day, the two of them returned with his father to search for the missing vehicle, but there was no trace of it anywhere. His father concluded it must have been stolen and reported it, though nothing ever came of the investigation. Even now, years later, the car has never been recovered. To the man who lost it, there is only one explanation that makes sense. The Pontiac hadn't been stolen in any ordinary way. It had been left behind on that cold and unfamiliar road, abandoned in a world that wasn't his own, still waiting in a place he had accidentally slipped into before stumbling back out again. An out-of-place store. Something unusual happened to a man on what should have been a normal, hurried morning. He was running late for work while his wife stayed home tending to their 1-year-old who had come down with a cold. Before he left, she asked him to stop at Walgreens to pick up some cough medicine for the baby. Even though he was pressed for time, he agreed, not wanting his son to go without it. As he drove, his wife stayed on the line, reminding him exactly what brand to get. The parking lot was full, traffic heavy on the street, and as he hurried toward the entrance, he noticed a woman struggling with their child near the curb, the boy crying as she tried to fasten him into the car seat. With the wife's voice still in his ear, he glanced at the clock on his phone and stepped inside. The second he crossed through the sliding doors, everything had shifted. His phone went dark, the call dropped, and the store before him looked completely abandoned. Fluorescent lights flickered cold above him, brighter and sharper than he remembered. The registers were empty, the aisles vacant. He turned around toward the street, expecting to see the packed line of cars he had just left behind, but it was gone. The road stretched out silent, the woman and her child nowhere to be found. It was as though the world outside had been erased. He then called out twice, with his voice carrying in the hollow quiet, and the feeling struck him that he had stepped into a place where he didn't belong. Trying to gather proof though, he reached for his phone, but it refused to turn on. He then walked a little farther into the store and turned down an aisle, and then just as suddenly as it had vanished, everything was back. Warm lighting filled the space, and music hummed through the speakers. Shoppers milled about, and at the front counter, a cashier rang up a customer mid-transaction as though nothing strange had happened. At that moment, his phone came back to life, ringing with an incoming call from his wife. She asked what had happened, saying the line had gone silent before dropping. Standing there, he realized he had no explanation. The store looked normal, his phone worked fine, and outside, cars once again lined the street. He bought the medicine, walked back out, and carried on with his day, left with only the memory of those few moments where the world seemed to shift into another version of itself before snapping back without reason. A different version. A woman in the UK once shared an experience that left her questioning whether she had slipped into the life of another version of herself. She and her boyfriend had gone hiking on a hot summer day, and by the time they reached the end of their route, she was worn out but otherwise fine. He decided to climb a large rock formation they had visited before, while she walked the longer path around to meet him on the other side. As she waited, anxious thoughts crept in, worrying he might have hurt himself because he was taking longer than usual. In that moment, everything changed. Her thoughts stopped being her own, and the next thing in her mind wasn't concern for her boyfriend at all. It was confusion over why she was even thinking about him, since she had come there alone. Nothing around her shifted, but she felt herself turn into another person entirely. This version of herself carried a heavy pack with camping gear, something her real self hadn't brought, and was planning to set up camp nearby. She brushed hair from her eyes and noticed it was dark brown and shorter, not the longer bleached out blonde she had been growing out. She stood taller, stronger, and her body felt more capable on the uneven ground. The personality was different too. Where she normally lived with low self-esteem, anxiety, and a dependence on others, this version was steady and practical. She knew exactly where she was going, confident with directions, and she carried the mindset of someone used to being on her own. There was even a brief moment where she pictured the man she had been waiting for on the rocks, but to her, he was just an unfamiliar stranger glimpsed in her imagination. As this other self, she turned and began to head back toward the camping spot she now remembered, but halfway there, she saw her boyfriend climbing down from the rocks. In an instant, she snapped back into her original self. Fear and sadness replaced the confidence she had just felt. She looked at her arms and hair, now back to normal, and realized how strong and certain she had been only moments earlier. The entire episode had lasted only about 5 minutes too. The details, though, lingered after. While she was her alternate self, she hadn't craved nicotine from her vape, which in reality had been empty. She could hear the wind and the birds, even though her surgery had left her partially deaf to higher frequencies. The other version of herself was angry, quick to fight, but not plagued by constant worry. When she returned to her own body, she couldn't shake the thought that she had been robbed of a better life. That night, she dreamed she was the other woman again, and waking left her in tears because it felt like being pulled away from a life where she had been happier. She insisted she hadn't been sick, dehydrated, or disoriented from the heat. Nothing explained why her sense of identity had fractured so completely while awake. Her boyfriend didn't dismiss it either. He actually admitted he'd once dreamed of being another version of himself, though she had lived it in full consciousness. The experience stayed with her after that, changing the way she saw herself, and she couldn't stop wondering if, for those minutes, she had crossed paths with a parallel life. The call from another life. About 5 years ago, a woman stayed with her husband and their 12-month-old while the rest of her family, her parents, and 2 sisters went on a trip across Europe. One night, around 3 in the morning, her phone started ringing. It was her dad. At first, she ignored it, figuring he must have forgotten the time difference, but then the calls kept coming. Within minutes, she had a dozen missed calls from her parents and sisters, along with text messages that made no sense. Each one was emotional, telling her to stay strong, that everything would be okay, and that they loved her and were getting the next flight home. Panicked, she answered the next call. Her dad's voice was shaking, something she wasn't used to. He told her he had been on the phone with her for an hour, consoling her after she had broken down about being pregnant and saying her husband had walked out. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had been asleep since 10 the night before, her husband was right beside her, and she wasn't pregnant. She told her dad he must be mistaken, but he snapped back, insisting she stop lying. He said he had spent an hour listening to her in tears, that her story had been detailed and convincing, and that even her sisters had spoken to her during the call. She checked her phone, expecting maybe she had sleep dialed him, but there was nothing. No outgoing calls at all, only the missed ones. Her husband's phone showed no calls either. Her dad checked his call log and saw that the number he spoke to didn't even come from her phone. It was listed as unknown. Still, he was certain that it was her. He said he knew her voice, and her sisters backed him up, swearing she had told them specific things only she could have known. She had apparently mentioned a family friend too who was staying at her parents' house, which was true, and she had said she needed to cancel a dentist appointment because of being called into work, which also matched her real schedule. Her sister recalled hearing another person in the background too, supposedly a friend she had gone to stay with for safety, but when pressed, she wouldn't give a name. The conversation ended only when the version of her on the line calmed down and said she needed to let her friend sleep. To her family, it was completely real. They were shaken enough to book flights home until she sent a photo of herself and her husband together, proving nothing had happened. They stayed on the phone until dawn, trying to make sense of it, though no explanation ever came. Her father still refuses to talk much about it, only shaking his head when the subject comes up. Her sisters remember it just as clearly as he does. For them, they had spoken to her in crisis. For her, she had been asleep the entire time. To this day, she asked them to repeat what was said, fascinated by the details that matched her real life, but the experience disturbs everyone involved. Her family can't let go of the memory of the voice they knew was hers, telling them something that never happened. The Empty Boulevard. Nearly 3 decades ago, a man driving from work in Los Angeles experienced something that convinced him he might have crossed into another existence. He was 25 at the time, living in Brentwood and taking Sunset Boulevard west late on a Saturday evening. For those who know the area, there's a stretch near UCLA where the road winds with no shoulder and only 2 lanes in each direction. Traffic was steady that night, and as he drove into one of the curves, a car suddenly spun out just ahead of him, ending up sideways across his lane. There was no room to stop. To his right, another car blocked any escape, yet instinct forced him to jerk the wheel sharply that way. Somehow, he missed the first car and immediately swung back left, still trying to avoid hitting anyone. In those moments, his mind was filled with something he didn't expect. A memory surfaced of being 3 years old with his mother at Disney World, a detail he had never recalled before. It struck him that his life was flashing before his eyes, and he was certain this was the end. The panic was overwhelming. He screamed, whether out loud or only inside his head, begging for more time, shouting that he wasn't ready to die. The next thing he knew, his car had spun out and come to a stop perpendicular across the opposite lanes. When he looked around, everything was gone. The traffic that had been thick with cars only seconds earlier had vanished. The boulevard, usually crowded on a Saturday night, was now completely empty. He put the car in reverse after that, straightened it out, and drove the rest of the way home in a daze. In the 5 minutes it took to reach his apartment, he didn't pass another vehicle, not even a single car. When he parked and stepped outside, there weren't even people on the sidewalks. He walked to his door, convinced he had died, but because he had shouted no in those final seconds, he thought maybe he had been pulled into some strange limbo instead of death. Desperate for proof, he called a close friend. He asked her to confirm his name, age, the city they lived in, and the date. She was startled, but she answered each question, and he admitted that he wasn't sure he was even alive or really on the phone with her. The part that still haunts him is the impossibility of the situation. There had been no space for his car to escape the impact, and he shouldn't have survived. For years afterward, he questioned whether his life since then had been real at all or just an elaborate hallucination as he lay dying on Sunset Boulevard. Over time, meditation and study of both spirituality and physics gave him a new way of framing it. He began to wonder if, in those seconds, he hadn't cheated death in the usual sense, but instead slipped into a parallel version of life where he continued on, while another version of himself ended on that curve. The memory of an empty boulevard and the certainty he had once had of death never left him. The Vanished Nail. In the summer of 2018, a woman and her 2 daughters stayed with her mother for several weeks while waiting to move into their new house. Her mother lived in a quiet senior community in a small 1-bedroom apartment. To make it work, the 3 of them slept on air mattresses in the living room. One night, as she was inflating one of the mattresses, her oldest daughter, sitting on the couch, suddenly pointed to the wall. "Mom, look, the neighbor must have hammered a nail too far. It's poking through over here." At first, she didn't understand, but when she walked over, she saw it herself. The sharp end of a nail was sticking out from her mother's wall. She touched it to make sure, and it was real. Her youngest climbed up on the couch and pressed her finger against it too. They called for their mother, who came out from the bedroom. When shown the nail, she agreed that the neighbor must have driven it too far through the wall and said she'd speak with management in the morning since it was too late to bother anyone that night. Satisfied for the moment, they let it go. The next morning, though, everything changed. While drying her hair in the bathroom, the oldest daughter came in and said, "Mom, the nail is gone." She thought maybe the neighbors had simply removed it, but her daughter insisted it looked as though it had never been there at all. When she checked, she saw that the wall was perfectly smooth, no hole, no crack in the paint, nothing. It was as if the nail had never even existed. Completely unsettled, she brought her mother in to look, only to find that her mother had no memory of the conversation from the night before. She didn't recall seeing the nail or saying she talked to management. The woman and her daughters were stunned. They had all touched it and they had all spoken about it. How could their mother now deny she had ever been part of it? What made the situation stranger was how the entire day leading up to the nail sighting had already felt unusual. Earlier that afternoon, she had texted her boyfriend saying she felt scattered, almost as if pieces of her were spread across different realities. Her daughters had complained of the same thing while she was at work, sending messages that the day felt wrong and heavy. One of them even remarked that it felt like someone had died. It was only after realizing the nail was gone that they connected the feeling of that day to what had happened. For the three of them, the memory of that nail was clear, solid, and shared. For her mother, though, it was nothing but confusion. To this day, they have no explanation for why the wall bore no trace, why their mother seemed to forget, or why that particular day carried such an overwhelming sense of displacement. It remains one of those moments that refuses to fade, a small but unshakable detail that made them question whether they had briefly stepped into a reality that was not their own. A town that doesn't exist. In the hills of rural southern Appalachia, a man set out one afternoon to the next county to look at a lawnmower. The road was familiar to him, though he hadn't traveled in it in more than a year. And along that route sat a small community he had passed many times before, little more than a cluster of houses and an old store. This time, however, the landscape was unrecognizable. Where the scattered homes had always been, there now stood a fully realized town. Traffic lights hung over the streets, sidewalks stretched along a bustling main road, and 15 to 20 storefronts stood in neat rows. Unlike the fading towns that dotted the region, places that had peaked in the middle of the last century and fallen into disrepair, this one looked pristine. The brickwork was clean, the glass windows gleamed, and the sidewalks looked freshly swept. Startled, he pulled into a space along the curb. The people he saw looked ordinary enough, weathered in the way mountain folk often are, and dressed in modern clothing. The cars along the street ranged from new to 20 years old, nothing really unusual. Yet everything about the place felt too new, too perfectly maintained. He stepped into a restaurant marked Cream of the Crop Cafe. Inside, the decor was the kind seen in diners across the country. Booths and tables, a counter with a register, and walls hung with portraits of James Dean and Marilyn Monroe. He asked the young woman behind the counter where he was. She looked puzzled, though his accent and appearance marked him as a local, and answered Minneapolis. He pressed her further, asking when the town had been built. She replied, just as puzzled, that it had been there since the 1800s. Unable to make sense of it, he left and continued on to his errand. An hour later, driving back the same way, he found only what he had always known, a handful of houses and an old general store. The town, with its red lights, sidewalks, and shining storefronts, was now gone. The bridge that didn't exist. In the 1940s, on the edge of a small New Jersey town, an ordinary Sunday walk turned into something that would puzzle a family for generations. The account was passed down by a grandmother who swore by its truth, always repeating the details the same way, convinced her parents had stepped into a place that didn't belong. For clarity, their real names have been forgotten over time, so they're referred to here as simply Jane and John. The couple had lived in the town for more than 20 years, long enough to know every street, shopfront, and neighbor by heart. On this particular Sunday afternoon, with the sun high and the sky perfectly clear, they set out for one of their usual strolls. Nothing about the day stood out until they wandered onto a street they had never seen before. At the end of this unfamiliar road stood a bridge. Neither of them could recall it ever existing, which struck them as odd considering how well they knew the town. Curious, they approached it. The bridge was striking, cast iron with floral decorations worked into its frame, and crossing it felt both natural and strange. On the other side, they found themselves in a part of town that didn't match their memory. What struck them first was the emptiness. Not a single person was walking about. During that era, cars were rare and nearly everyone traveled on foot. Yet the streets were deserted. They walked further, looking at the storefronts, and noticed that while the buildings resembled familiar businesses, many of the names seemed slightly off. A shop that should have been called Dave's was instead Dan's. Other names were altered by just a letter or two, small details that disturbed them the more they noticed. Eventually, they made their way home. When they later asked friends and neighbors about the bridge, every reply was the same: "What bridge?" Stunned, Jane and John compared their memories and agreed without doubt that they had stepped onto a road that shouldn't have been there, crossed a bridge that did not exist, and walked through a version of their town that was somehow different. John, being methodical, decided to test their experience. He drew a large grid of the town, and over the next several weeks, they carefully walked every single street, determined to find the path that had led them to the bridge. But no matter how thorough they were, it never appeared again. Even when John consulted the city planners, he was met with blank stares, since no such street or bridge had ever been recorded. What stayed with the family most wasn't just the ornate bridge or the altered shop names though, but the memory of complete silence. On a bright Sunday during wartime, when people were always out on the streets, the town they walked through was empty. The grandmother later said she believed her parents had stumbled into a parallel version of their town, one that was almost the same yet noticeably wrong, and that by chance they had found their way back before the door to it closed for good. From Phoenix to nowhere. Early one morning in Phoenix, a Lyft driver finished a drop-off and set out for home, expecting only a short 5-minute drive. It was around 4 a.m., the streets quiet with light traffic, and he found himself admiring the skyline. The high-rises and towers stood clear against the dark November sky, a familiar view along a route he had taken hundreds of times. He followed behind a white Nissan, keeping an eye on his speed, and everything felt routine until a single glance at the dashboard changed the entire night. When he looked up again, less than a second later, the city was gone. The traffic, the buildings, and the street lights had vanished. In their place stretched open rural land near where Scottsdale meets Mesa. No cars, no people, no signs of the Phoenix streets he had just been driving on. His compass showed he was now heading east instead of west, though only moments before he had been certain of his direction. The shift left him stunned. He tried to reason through it to find some mistake in his navigation, but nothing made sense. He had been on Thomas Road, the same road where his passengers lived, and yet suddenly he found himself on McDowell and Pima. That location wasn't close by since it was about 15 miles away, a full 20-minute drive from where he had been. The distance hadn't been covered. It had simply changed in the blink of an eye. The unease deepened as he searched for his way back. The area felt wrong and the atmosphere heavy, as though something unseen hung over him. The sensation was close to dread, a pressure that made him want to get out as quickly as possible. He then pulled up directions on his phone and followed the freeway back, needing the full 20 minutes to return to where he had been just moments earlier before the sudden shift. By the time he got home, he was too off edge to continue driving. He ended his Lyft shift early and sat with experience, unable to really sleep. The questions pressed on him without relief, since how could a routine drive west across Phoenix turn into a sudden jump east to another town? The whole experience left him freaked out, still searching for an explanation and wondering if anyone else had ever slipped into the same strange space. The double arrival. In a quiet college town, 3 students shared a campus-owned house that sat right beside a wide, brightly lit parking lot belonging to one of the school's athletic facilities. Most nights, the lot was completely empty unless there was a game or practice, which made it the obvious place for visitors to leave their cars. One of the roommates' boyfriends had become such a regular presence that he was practically considered a fourth tenant. Everyone in the house knew him well, as did their circle of friends, and his car was nearly impossible to mistake. It was a rare model, modified and painted in a color nobody else in the town seemed to drive. That night, he had been at a fraternity event but was expected to stop by afterward. Only two of the housemates were awake, sitting out on the porch in the stillness of the evening, talking idly and watching the road. When a car appeared in the distance, they both recognized it at once. It was his, without question, and the sight of it immediately pulled them to their feet. He normally called on his way back from anywhere, but this time he hadn't, which struck them as unusual. As the vehicle drew closer and turned into the lot, the doubt disappeared. The lot was lit up bright as day, and they could see not only the details of the car, but also the figure behind the wheel. Both were convinced that it was him. One of them reached the edge of the lot first and waved as he pulled in. Instead of stopping though, he looked directly at her and then continued driving, rolling straight through the lot toward the far exit. They waited, expecting him to loop back around in some kind of playful routine, but they watched as the car left the lot entirely and turned down the road away from them. It was such an ordinary action, yet in that moment it felt completely wrong. Still certain it had been him, a call was placed immediately. He answered over the noise of a crowded room, music and voices filling the background. He said he was still at the fraternity house though and hadn't left yet. The answer made no sense. They had just seen his car, they had seen his face, and now he was insisting he hadn't even gone on the road. The disconnect was so sharp that one of them hung up quickly, too disturbed to press him further. Minutes later, he did arrive for real. This time, he pulled into the same lot in the same car, exactly as he always did, and parked. The scene looked identical to what had already happened, as if the universe had replayed a moment out of order. That incident wasn't the only one to cause unease in the house though. Another evening, his girlfriend stood in the bathroom, brushing her teeth with the door open. From the corner of her eye, she saw her cat dash down the hall toward the kitchen, her boyfriend right behind, chasing the cat the way he often did. She followed them, only to find the cat alone in the kitchen. When she returned to the bedroom, he was lying on the bed, claiming he had never left the room. A visiting friend later described something eerily similar, saying she felt and heard someone walking past her in the hall when there was no one there at all. The experiences were never violent, but they carried a weight that was hard to ignore. They were rooted in the ordinary, the familiar sounds of footsteps, the routine of pulling into a parking lot, the playful chase of a pet, and that was what made them so disturbing. The moments unfolded exactly as they should have, until the small details unraveled and revealed something that could not be explained. For those who lived there, it left a lasting impression, as if time or reality occasionally slipped just enough to let another version of events appear, only to vanish again. The day the store changed. At a time around November a couple years ago, a man set out on a routine trip to his local supermarket, the kind of errand he had done countless times before. He was planning to pick up heavier items, so he approached the trolley bay with a pound coin in hand, prepared to unlock one of the battered carts that always required a deposit. But instead of the usual lineup, he found a row of brand new trolleys gleaming under the lights, and none of them required coins at all. Surprised but not alarmed, he asked a staff member nearby when the coin locks had been removed. She looked at him oddly and said the trolleys had never required coins. That small contradiction disturbed him, but he brushed it aside and went inside. The moment he stepped through the doors, however, the sense of wrongness grew stronger. The aisles were completely rearranged, with familiar sections now shifted into unfamiliar places. Even the staff seemed out of place. The red-haired woman who always worked the kiosk was now outside, pushing carts across the floor. Every detail felt familiar, yet subtly rearranged, as if you were walking through a version of the supermarket that looked like his but didn't quite belong to it. When he left, his partner, waiting in the car, remarked on the shiny new carts without him even prompting. That single comment confirmed he wasn't imagining things. The strangeness deepened the following day too. They returned to the same store only to find the trolleys back to their dented, coin-locked condition. The aisles were restored to their usual layout and the staff were back in their expected positions. None of the previous day's oddities remained. If he had gone alone, he might have convinced himself it was a lapse of memory or a moment of confusion. But with a witness noting the same changes, the event lingers as something far harder to explain. For a single day, it seemed the supermarket belonged to another version of reality, close enough to pass as normal, yet different in ways that could not be overlooked. Shift in the elevator. In 2013, a student living in a small studio apartment in London experienced something that has stayed with him ever since. He often stopped at the Sainsbury near his building, visiting so regularly that he had become familiar with the staff. Their faces and routines had become part of the everyday rhythm of his life. One evening, though, he left his apartment as usual and stepped into the elevator. But what happened during that ride is difficult for him to describe. It was as if reality had skipped like a film reel, a sudden jump cut where nothing had moved, yet everything felt displaced. A wave of motion sickness hit him, the kind of disorientation that usually follows jet lag, leaving him unsteady. Still, he carried on to the store. When he arrived, nothing looked wrong at first, yet he quickly realized he didn't recognize a single employee. The regular cashiers and stock clerks he knew were gone, replaced by people he had never seen before. Trying to make sense of it, he asked where the others were, assuming they must have had the night off. The answer, though, only deepened his confusion. These employees claimed they had never heard of the staff he described, insisting they had been working there for quite some time. He then finished his shopping and returned home. Again, the elevator ride brought the same jarring sensation, a disjointed shift that left him lightheaded. But the next day, when he went back to Sainsbury's, everything appeared normal. The familiar faces had returned, and when he asked if they'd been working the previous evening, they confirmed that they had. None of them recalled seeing him there, and puzzled, he showed them his receipt from the night before. The address matched the store exactly, but the details didn't. The items listed were not from the registers either. Even the staff, normally casual and cheerful, were left stunned by what they saw. To this day, he has no explanation, and the elevator seemed to act as the trigger, carrying him somewhere only slightly different, yet undeniably altered. For one evening, the store he knew so well was not the same place at all.